Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Looks like we've got a great crowd already this afternoon. Really looking forward to another Inside the SOC series here. It looks like the numbers of participants is starting to slow down that are joining. So love to get things kicked off here and get started. We got some great topics that we're going to cover today. But just for everyone's awareness, my name is Jason Barnheiser. I am the Director of Threat Operations here at Blackpoint. I am joined again today with Nevin Beal. He is our Principal MDR Analyst. Sam Decker, he is our Threat Intelligence Engineer. And then Nathan Danko joins us today from the Detection Engineering side. He is our Lead Detection Engineer. So we're going to get some insights from him on SIEM if you kind of hang out towards the end of the presentation as well. So we're going to dive into kind of like our normal flow and normal topics. Appreciate everyone joining us again today. But again, we're going to break this down again into like 3 different sections to make it a little digestible for everyone. First off, we're going to talk about application control. We've hinted around this a little bit when we've talked about rogue RMM abuse and additional abuse in partner environments. So really what we're looking at here is it's really crucial to understand what is running in your environment, but at the same time, you want to be able to block the things that are not supposed to be running in your environment. So, thinking a little bit about leveraging application control and some of the mechanisms there is great. And we'll show you kind of like the power of application control in a real world example in a breach that we saw. Second step that we're going to talk about is after the breach, right? We all hate the B word, but we will talk about breaches and kind of, what your common remediation strategies are, hardening techniques based on what we've seen with real world compromise, and really dive into a little bit of like what happens after the fact, what's your strategy, what's your plan for recovery, and what do we commonly see as like pitfalls and things that partners can do to kind of level up that, that capability after something occurs, internally at one of our end customers or partner environments. And then last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about SIEM considerations. So we have a SIEM here at Blackpoint, but it can be a way to like level up your services, but it's also a way to further weigh down your team if not implemented properly. So we'll talk a little bit about SIEM implementation strategies alongside, how Blackpoint kind of approaches alerting with SIEM and kind of the pros and cons of that larger data lake as well. Jumping into kind of like our quick wrap up over the last month, there's a newcomer that we've seen here. So Cloud Compromise over here on the right hand side has jumped up into our number 3 for the month. FakeCaptcha and SSL VPN continue to lead the way. We've discussed a lot about FakeCaptcha on previous calls, so we're not going to go into that as in depth. SSL VPN Compromise, we're going to talk a little bit about that again today just because it's so hot and the level of access that it allows a threat actor to gain once they're able to get into the network. But our third bullet point over here that's popped up that's new if you've been following along with us is Cloud Compromise. We are seeing a very large scale direct send abuse and device code phishing campaign that is continuing to kind of impact customers kind of across our stack, right? This is not targeted at anyone specifically, but we're seeing it across multiple verticals, and it's something that we've seen be very effective because of the way it's leveraging social engineering from the user's perspective. Nevin, do you want to talk just a little bit about some of the abuse that we've seen with like direct send, but also kind of layering that on top of device code phishing as well, and what that means for our partners?
Yeah, absolutely. So direct send is something that's always been it's been kicking off in a bigger influx recently. It's using a legitimate Microsoft functionality for like, say you want something to print, things of that nature. Threat actors are abusing it to start sending phishing emails, spoofing them as like, hey, the user sent themselves an email. And a lot of times these emails the lure will be surrounding device code phishing. So, hey, log in, type the specific code that gives the threat actor access, and then we start seeing them sort of skyrocket into these business email compromises and start working on that post exploitation as well.
Yeah, and I see that everyone in the chat is kind of, commiserating with us, so to speak, where they're saying that user-driven attacks are generally the most risk they see for initial access, right? So again, we're continuing to kind of see FakeCaptcha, phishing, social engineering be very useful in circumventing our normal controls by having the user do things for us, right? So, Sam, I know we've talked a lot about FakeCaptcha, but for anyone new on the call, why is this so prevalent and why does it seem to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've touched on this a lot, and I think it really comes down to the fact of like ease of use, right, for the user. Like when they see a fake captcha prompt, and the typical captcha prompts are often very monotonous and frustrating sometimes, when you're selecting like the 17th crosswalk and you're like, why am I not, a human yet? And so like to be able to just like simply like press a couple commands, and like literally you're just hitting, Control V and pasting and running it, right? Like it's very easy, and it's from like the user perspective, it's like oh yeah, I could do this. This is easy, right? I'm human, and it's done.
Yeah. FakeCaptcha was the best thing to happen to me, right? Because I always fail those prompts. It's like get a bicycle or a bus or a stoplight, and I'm always clicking the boxes, and I'm like, I swear I'm getting this right, but I'm never getting through the next door. But I do think that's something to focus on, is the ease of access that it allows. And really what we're seeing is this is prevalent across lots of different sites and domains. We actually had a customer that was a construction firm that commonly visited a construction training website, and that was compromised in delivering FakeCaptcha. So it's those kind of things where these legitimate and sometimes common sites are infected, and users' guard is taken down because they see these things. They understand that it's something that we normally do in order to say I'm not a robot, but they don't understand the implications on what's going on in the back end. So these three are still kind of what I would consider our heaviest hitters when it comes to initial access and compromise. We've got a lot of great blog content on all of these topics, so please make sure you're kind of taking a look at that as well. We've done a lot of deep dives into these things, but we'll continue to kind of track these campaigns as they emerge and ensure that our partners are aware of these kind of things and how to further protect themselves. So I did want to dive into kind of like some of our main topics today, right? The first one that kind of we wanted to talk about and touch base on was application control, right? I've got the tagline there of what's lurking crossed out, running in your environment, right? Because I think those two things can kind of go hand in hand. Those things that are running that we don't really have a great understanding of, or maybe we've got less than stellar asset inventory or software management policies, those kind of things, that we've seen a lot of threat actors leverage legitimate applications to create compromise in an environment. So we wanted to kind of touch base on why it's better to detect and block these things rather than just detect them. So Sam, I know you were kind of doing some additional research into application control overall and how it can kind of be a layered approach to the detection methodology. But why are we having the discussion around an alert only approach versus a blocking approach, and what are the bigger differences there overall for our partners?
Yeah, the bar none, the biggest thing is the time to contain, right? Because if we're alerting on it, regardless of how fast your SOC is, there is still some kind of manual like triage that has to go into an alert when the incident isn't already contained, right? If the application is blocked outright, there's the threat is stopped, right? There's no manual intervention. They don't get any dwell time in the environment. And so when you're relying on an alert only approach, regardless of how fast your SOC is, right, there still is a time to respond to that and contain it. And so the attacker does have some dwell time. And what we've seen with a lot of these is that they move very, very quickly, right? Like it's often like as soon as that application is executed, that rogue RMM for example, they're installing a second one because they understand this kind of workflow that like, hey, if we don't establish persistence on this host, within a few minutes, our access may be cut off, right? So being able to stop that before they get that dwell time and are able to execute. And, often we've talked, I'll go back to the RMM example, because I think that's kind of the one we're seeing most often right now. But this really applies to any kind of like, application or malicious application, right? Like if the threat actor is able to run like an IP scanner, right, in your environment, like some kind of, any kind of, reconnaissance tool in your environment, right? Even if you're able to contain that after they've already run the reconnaissance tool, they have the findings, right? And so But going back to the RMM example, right? If they're able to establish persistence with a second RMM, they're relying on whatever SOC is triaging that alert to maybe not see the second one, and they remove the first one, but the threat actor already established persistence with a second one. Maybe they've dropped a remote access Trojan or something else along those lines, and it gives them that there's more room for error, right? In that time that they're able to operate in the environment.
Yeah, I think it's similar to like the defense in-depth approach that we're talking about here. Attackers almost have like an attack in-depth approach now, where they are layering multiple persistence mechanisms and multiple capabilities on top of each other in a hope that an analyst or someone that's reviewing these alerts in a console would say, hey, I've got this. I got rid of this RMM tool that they used, and I'm good to go, right? And they move on. But they don't see the rest of those things kind of in depth that are deployed, and really having that kind of app control capability to block these things and alert on them helps a lot, because you're stopping that kill chain immediately and causing that additional headache for the attacker, rather than relying on someone to come back behind that piece and really understand kind of like what else is going on and really dig in deeper. That level of application control helps you to further protect that environment during the attack chain rather than after.
Yeah, and they understand that, right? They know that the second they actually do get successful execution, that they're on a clock.
Yeah,
and so they're running automated playbooks. They got it very well automated and scripted out, and very good run books to be able to establish persistence once they get that first execution. So if you can cut that off before they even get it, then it's a lot less headache.
And a lot of times it's the Russian nesting doll effect is like what I like to call it. They're abusing the limited KYC portion to the trials for these RMMs. So hey, create a burner account, get access to a trial for XYZ RMM. Then they just do that for 2 or 3 different RMMs, and then they actually have one that they have some bogus credentials in, but that gives them long persistent access. So they're daisy chaining these trials to get the deployment of the one that they have long-term access in. And then through each executions, they're just adding these additional layers of persistence and sort of obfuscation towards their main goals.
Yeah. Yeah, and really what we've got, what that looks like is kind of like here, right? Like this is a real RMM based intrusion that we've seen, and with managed application control, we see that they download that payload and they execute that initial RMM deployment, and we block that immediately, right? But if you don't do that, that's where Nevin kind of talks a little bit about the Russian nesting doll effect in that persistence area, is multiple RMM deployments, right? They're deploying not one tool, but many, in the hopes that the one tool they deploy doesn't get found by the security team and doesn't get removed, and now they still have that persistent access, and then they move on and kind of start mapping the network and doing additional things to kind of further that attack chain. I think, Nate, this is a good time to kind of talk about like application control and how to do it, right? It's probably not a good way of doing application control and blocking things by just using like an executable name, right? Those are mutable and they're changeable by the threat actor based on their flavor of the month. So let's talk a little bit about like how we take that approach for application control and what we're looking at to kind of block and tackle those things when they're seen in our product.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, yeah, executable names are way too variable, way too malleable. They can be changed too often. So that's why a part of our detection theory is we look at this certificate signing cert. So essentially like where the software is coming from, who's signing it, as one of our detection vectors. That's really helped us improve, kind of narrow down a lot of these specific software pieces, because that variable is a lot harder to change than something as simple as the executable name. And then we layer that on top of it by looking at the standard hashes for these different files to really kind of maintain a library where we have multiple detection methods. So we're not just relying on name equals bad, like you might find in more of a common AV solution. We're relying on a lot more of those harder to change, harder to obfuscate pieces of the software, the kind of the software DNA almost, to kind of rely on that as our detection vector to really improve our detection surface and really just make sure we're being accurate as possible. Because like as Sam and Nevin said, time is of the essence here. Like it's all of a time game from the defender's perspective, and having these multiple detection layers is what really helps us kind of narrow and lock this stuff down on the onset.
Yeah, so having multiple checks and balances in place is important, because threat actors can change payloads. They can wrap things together together, but having that kind of like code signing cert helps us to be able to kind of call those things out even if they're modified, so that way we can come in and block those things and kind of provide that additional layer of coverage. Generally we see a lot of the stuff in this chain. Sam and Evan, you kind of want to walk us through, like, this seems to be fairly prevalent in the way that we see RMM abuse overall. And I know this wasn't one of our top 3 for this month, but I do consider this to be a very big threat for our partners because of how these campaigns are being leveraged. So do you want to talk about like the evolution and what we're seeing on RMM based intrusions and kind of what we can expect to kind of come down the pipeline there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's one of those things where we've been seeing this for like well over a year now, several years, and it's it really kind of adapts with the time, right? Like a few months ago, we were seeing a lot of, tax themed lures and stuff, social security documents. Now, kind of in that lull, they kind of move back towards just like generic meeting invites. We see like stuff like software downloads as well. Like I think yesterday we saw like an Adobe Reader, some kind of like download. Right, they're kind of like constantly changing these payloads when it gets towards the holidays. It'll be like party invites and stuff like that, and all they're doing is, again, it's not going to be named Screen Connect installer. It's going to be, some generic named lure executable, and it installs Screen Connect. And so again, going back to kind of the detection theory, that allows us to really key in on what's actually happening, right? What is that actual payload, right? Because the file name itself is usually not. I can't even think of a time where we've actually seen them like, trick a user into downloading, screenconnect.exe and running it, right? Typically it's going to be something else.
It's focusing more on tricking the user to click a button. So whether it's clicking something that's attached in an email, clicking something that's provided to them in like, hey, this is your new software update, download, click, execute kind of thing. The lure will always change based on sort of the psychology they're trying to get the user to fall into the specific trap. But the same principle as Sam was saying happens. They some shape or form get some installer, they click the installer, it then runs the Screen Connect, and then we start the Russian nesting doll type of executions towards the deploying of each additional RMMs.
Yeah, and again,
it goes back to. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, it goes back to like the social engineering aspect of it all, right? Like, this is why threat actors are being effective, is because they're targeting that end user, and it's not the end user's fault at the end of the day, right? Because we saw one case the other day where they had spam bombed the user's inbox, right? They flooded the inbox with a bunch of junk, and then they called them from an external Teams connection, impersonating an IT user, right? So again, we're using all of these trusted applications and trusted connections to then inherently break that trust and leverage that in order for them to be able to gain that initial access and get that additional capabilities. So, it's all about like educating users on where these softwares should be downloaded from, right? Have that central repository and be able to navigate users to a central location where there is a known good file for them to be able to download, but then also making sure that they really understand like how tech support is going to get a hold of them, right? How does your MSP normally contact users, and how can an end user verify that they are indeed talking to you as the MSP partner or your internal IT teams, to make sure you have those proper checks when these social engineering cases do kind of pop up and try to move forward. So yeah, definitely thinking about kind of like managed application control, intervention, how those things can kind of couple together and help to prevent further abuse, but also prevent and alert abuse, right? All of our application control alerts, when we flag something malicious, are sent to our SOC for further review, right? So you get that immediate block, and you also get that capability of reviewing that in real time to say, hey, how did this thing get here? Is this endpoint still potentially, being impacted, or are there additional executions that could be done against this endpoint based on where these things came from? Okay, So we talked about RMM abuse and preventing a breach and preventing these kind of things, but I think there's a really good conversation to be had, and we got some feedback from previous webinars around like actionable steps and insights for when something does occur, right? What do we do to remediate incidents, and how do we recover from these things effectively so that way we don't have like a reinfection, or we don't have, you know, a case where, you know, something is dormant in an environment, and how those things can kind of impact us down the road as well. And, you know, I think Mike Tyson has the best quote for this, which is everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? I'm sure a lot of people on these calls have actionable IR, you know, documents and playbooks, but when was the last time you ran one of those playbooks? And when was the last time you stress tested that in kind of like a pressure cooker situation to see how your teams do respond to these things? So we wanted to take this approach from another one of those kind of like 3 key pillars of threats that we've seen. And we wanted to wrap this around kind of like an SSL VPN compromise and what that looks like, what remediation strategies after the fact look like, and how, you know, we can do additional hardening of those SSL VPNs to prevent that in the future as well. So we're going to run through this with the team. And we're going to use this attack chain and timeline kind of as like our Bible moving forward here for how we're going to approach this and how we're going to recover from something like this, right? So, Nevin, do you want to go a little bit through this attack chain here? This is a very kind of like straightforward, cut and dry, you know, VPN compromise that we normally see. But what does that look like kind of for the partners that may not have experienced one of these things before?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in the age of identity, so a lot of times these specific kill chains start with a compromised identity. So as we can see, sort of the number one, the initial access into the network was valid credentials. So the threat actor got these credentials in some shape or form, whether it be like an info steal or phishing, compromise of them in some aspect that led them to then, hey, I can log into the SSL VPN using these credentials. There's no actual exploit against the appliance. They're just authenticating in as a normal user. Once they have that sort of access into the internal network, they then start trying to move laterally throughout the network. They're using these credentials to move laterally, sort of understanding the lay of the land. If there's not proper network segmentation, they may be able to hit these different servers and end up in all these workstation servers, things of that nature. As they're moving laterally throughout the network, we typically see threat actors try and drop some sort of remote access tool and or RMM. A lot of times they're dropping things like AnyDesk, Atera, TeamViewer, Screen Connect to try and maintain that persistent access. So in a case that their access in their compromised via the SSL VPN becomes known, say the MSP partner remediates the account, resets credentials, things of that nature, revokes SSL VPN sessions. If that does happen, they do have some form of persistence via these remote access tools. A lot of times they'll also create local or domain joined accounts for persistence in the network and also assigning them higher level privileges as well. We see accounts such as like backup, Veeam, things of that nature. I think a lot of times they're masquerading as legitimate services as well. I think a recent one was like SVC-LDAP, so masquerading as like an LDAP service account. Once they have these higher privileged accounts, whether they give themselves these privileges or they come across or compromise credentials for like domain admins, enterprise admins, they then move towards these high value targets, or what I like to call the crown jewels. So think domain controllers, file servers, hypervisors, things of that nature. And then they start working towards their action on objectives. In the graph here, we have data exfiltration. So if they're on the file share server, they'll zip up or somehow compress the data associated for the compromised tenant and then sort of send it out to cloud storage or to a VPS that they own via SFTP or some other data transfer tool. Other cases, it's dropping ransomware payloads. It's up to sort of the imagination of the threat actor and sort of what their end goal is in the very far right of the kill chain.
I think it's important here to call out, like, we're not doing anything fancy, right? Like there's no, nation state, grade malware that's delivered here. There's no, insane CVE 0-day that's leveraged. We're using one identity to compromise that edge device and then laterally move to gain, the access that we need, right? And I think that's something important to call out, because I see a lot of times we're in the industry, we're hyping up a lot of like CVEs and 0 days and things like that. But, these identities that are tied to these edge devices are just as crucial, right? And, Sam, I know we see a lot of this stuff where, generally it's just a straight login, right? So like, I know we kind of talk a little bit about this in our our annual threat report on how, we're not necessarily seeing threat actors leverage, malware and implants and all kinds of, like very high fidelity indicators all the time. They're just using the identities that they can get access to. And then with those identities, using common tooling that floats around in normal environments in order to kind of hide under the radar. So, kind of like from a threat intelligence perspective, we're really seeing a lot of that shift to these common tools and common techniques that maybe aren't as sophisticated. So do you have any other kind of like insights into that when we're kind of talking about like VPN identity compromise specifically?
Yeah, I think that's like, to kind of like double down on that point, right? Like you said, they're not bringing in, different malware and stuff that's going to, potentially alert. They're in the environment. They can see what kind of tools are running. They're going to live off the land, right? They're going to use legitimate Windows applications, stuff that's already in the environment. Or, in the cases where they do pull down tooling, it's like dual use tooling, right? Like RMMs and other kind of like IT administrative tools that, like do have legitimate use cases where it's not going to, potentially is going to kind of fly under the radar, like you said. And I think this is kind of a good segue back to the managed application control as well, right? Like they start to pull down these other tools that, may have legitimate uses but aren't used in your environment, right? And having those blocked is and alerted to, right, is like a really big tip off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so let's say things slipped past your current provider, or maybe you have a security solution in place already that allowed for some of these things to laterally move, gain access, and ultimately have some sort of an impact to the end client. So again, we had a plan, but now we got punched in the face, right? So now we need to kind of figure out, how do we move forward from there, right? And I think a lot of that comes into, like your overall remediation strategy and breach tips, right? These are kind of like the common things that we see that need to be done once you have a breach like this, right? So we're going to talk about like high level, but kind of dig down into each one of these as we go through them. But, we're looking at like, first and foremost, resetting the credentials tied to that identity, hardening that VPN access overall, eradicating the threat actor that's in the environment and potentially rebuilding, and then verifying and recover, right? We've got like a 4-step process here that helps us move through this strategy, but I do want to kind of like dive into each one of these and why these are so important. So Nevin, I know you deal with a lot of kind of post compromise when you're brought in with our customers to kind of understand what's going on when we have these SSL VPN compromises. So let's kind of dive in first and foremost to like credential resetting, right? Like I know this may seem kind of like benign and like a no-brainer, but like why do we focus on this first and foremost in order to start the remediation strategy and buy us time for the following steps?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, they're leveraging a stolen identity to access this internal network via the SSL VPN. So if the credential is not reset, they still can just log back in with the SSL VPN. So say, for example, we're at stage 0, we just contain the alert, the account credentials are not reset right away, or say things happen, for some shape or form, the credentials aren't reset and the threat actor still has access to those credentials. A lot of times we've even seen threat actors do it in the past, where they just attempt to keep hitting the VPN appliance with these same credentials to see if they can maintain that access. And if the credentials aren't reset as soon as possible when we get to the further left of these breaches from the start, it sort of leads to continuous persistent access into the network by the threat actor.
Yeah. Step 1, reset that user, reset those credentials. But then, step 2 in that process is looking at hardening that VPN, right? Like, maybe MFA is not deployed, or maybe there is an older CVE sitting on that appliance that is being leveraged. So let's talk a little bit more about like, hardening that VPN access, but not going too far in depth, because I know we have some slides specifically on this. Why are we looking at deploying MFA, and why are we looking to kind of like restrict some of that management console?
Yeah, absolutely. MFA is not always a perfect solution in every shape or form. However, it does make it harder if a threat actor, say for example, if a threat actor just has the stolen credentials, they can log in with the stolen credentials right into the internal network. If there's some MFA that that's hitting them or during the authentication process. It prevents that ease of access into the network. So MFA is a great tool for stopping just straight logins into the internal networks via these threat actors and stolen identities. The bigger portion of it is like, okay, for these SSL VPN appliances, realistically, does the management portal need to be exposed to the whole world? And a lot of times the answer is no, because again, only the MSP partner, whoever manages the actual appliance, should be able to log in. So it's restricting access to these trusted IPs for these specific portals, whether it be authentication and or the management portal. So basically focusing on, okay, from our external position and sort of the external hardening aspect of it, who's allowed to hit these specific portals, who can authenticate, and then sort of working through the conditional access piece as well as the role access piece between the technical of, okay, who and how can they access the actual SSL VPN and get in the network, and then sort of the role access piece of like, okay, once they're in, how does the user leverage this SSL VPN to access the internal resources in the network?
Yeah, we're gonna touch on this again a little bit later for specific tips for hardening VPN access, and we'll even talk a little bit about like overall security posture for your clients. But I think this is a big one, right? And I like to steal from Robert Russell. He's our VP of Threat Ops here at Blackpoint. He likes to equate a lot of this to like a house, right? And I think it's a very good analogy where that VPN access is kind of like the front door, right? First and foremost, if there's no hardening of that, it's kind of like leaving your front door open, right? Closing the front door means you have to have some sort of access to get in, but maybe if you don't use a key to open the front door, now that MFA appliance isn't there to help prevent anyone from walking in the front door, right? So, those additional layers of hardening of that front door to your house are really important, so that way you can continue to harden some of these things, because as we've moved to a remote workforce, a lot of these things got deployed in the beginning and maybe they haven't been reassessed, right? Like, when's the last time you've gone out and reassessed a lot of these appliances to see what their current security posture is and what could be taken advantage of? Okay, so we've got kind of like the initial access, but now we got to go into steps 3 and 4, which are a little bit more in depth, right? Step 3 is about eradicating and rebuilding, right? These systems have been impacted now because we weren't able to stop them before they got in on the VPN. Now they've landed on these systems and they've created some additional things that we have to clean up. So let's kind of combine 3 and 4 together and talk a little bit about, like, once an endpoint is infected and it has some form of persistence on it, what are the common strategies that we're telling partners and customers to look at when it comes to like eventually getting the threat actor out of there, knowing the environment's clean, and then kind of verifying and recovering everything overall?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times threat actors, once they're on the machine, will execute code in memory, whether it be an implant, some sort of weird funky PowerShell that's very obfuscated, to sort of get that C2 channel outbound. And these executions in memory, a lot of time, it's hard to sort of understand without dumping the memory of the host and doing full forensics. So when it comes to, say, we see these executions, they may be dropping other RMMs, they can be modifying reg keys, things of that nature. We do know the host is impacted. We're recommending our partners just to rebuild the machine or revert from a known clean backup prior to the breach. This just allows us to cross T's and dot I's to, hey, when we do bring all the resources back online, the server is backed up from there. We have 100% confidence that there's nothing sort of left lingering in the network that could allow a threat actor to sort of regain access and sort of work again towards their action and objectives. And it's a sort of step-by-step process too of, okay, containing everything that's bad in the network associated with the breach, understanding or sort of what's been touched, what sort of the next steps need to be, working with the partner hand in hand to sort of provide those recommendations to help them mitigate not only sort of the current impacted systems, but also working on their proactively to sort of, okay, what can we do in the future to sort of mitigate this sort of IAV or initial access vector going forward. And once we have all these recommendations sent over, we know that all the impacted hosts are clean. We then work with a partner to bring the VPN back online and sort of allow them to resume normal operations as well.
I think the big thing after this is all said and done, right, is talking about kind of like how we continue to work with partners even after we've recovered, right? We don't kind of like wipe our hands clean and move on to the next. These environments that have these recent breaches are very much scrutinized by the SOC moving forward as well, because we want to ensure that we don't have that reinfection or we don't have people coming back in through that VPN again. that could, potentially impact us overall. So, these are a great, good foundation and start to kind of like your remediation strategy, and then continuing to build on top of those things as well. And we'll dive down into a little bit more on like the VPN hardening recommendations specifically. So we're going to talk about like 3 key areas, right? Identity and access, network controls, and then like overall maintenance. So that way we can ensure that we're making sure that these things are secure overall, and they're not falling into kind of some of these common pitfalls that we see that allow threat actors to gain access. And the reason we're really focusing on that is because of like this right here, right? Like these are all recent, Fortinet, SonicWall, SSO 0 days, that kind of thing. Like, it seems like every other week, one of these providers has some sort of, critical vulnerability that gets released, or we're seeing a new threat actor scanning those kind of things. The one in the middle there from GB Hackers, right, is, a massive recon scanning campaign, 84,000 scanning sessions hit SonicWall SSL VPN devices in 4 days, right? So I think it's important to understand that when these SSL VPNs are exposed externally out there, they're going to be found, right? The threat actors are scanning the internet constantly. They're looking for these kind of things as those initial access vectors, that kind of like, chink in the armor that they can use to eventually gain access and then, dive deeper into that network overall. So this is why we do focus a lot on SSL VPNs internally, because of the sheer volume that we're seeing when it comes to those compromises. So talking specifically a little bit about kind of like the access controls, Nevin, I know we've alluded to some of these in that stack, but ultimately we've got kind of like 6 pillars here that talk a little bit about like common access controls you can put into the environment. So let's go through and kind of touch on these and why these are important, and ultimately why these kind of help us leverage that additional security when it comes to identity and access for VPNs.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one, LDAP group isolation, the main thing is creating, again, 1, 2, and sort of 3 play into each other. So removing all LDAP users from the default SSL VPN group to prevent unauthorized access via default credentials. The big thing is we don't want like hey, anyone that's a legitimate Active Directory user to be able to authenticate to the SSL VPN. We want a specific Active Directory group for VPN access management, so we can ensure that there's no unauthorized or stale user accounts. And then also requiring that 80 group membership to grant SSL VPN access. Basically, if you don't have the group, there's no access via this VPN portal. A lot of times, the sort of negative aspect, if you don't do this, is you'll have these still counts like stale or sort of default accounts for like scan, scanner, print, things of that nature, where there's very weak credentials, and these threat actors will brute force these credentials. And a lot of times, since these are like printer accounts or scan to print, things of that nature, they don't have that MFA, because if they had MFA, it would break the actual process for the legitimate IT functionality of printing. So when these threat actors are brute forcing these accounts, if they're present in these AD group without proper sort of role-based segmentation, they log into the SSL VPN via that scanner account, and then they start moving laterally throughout the network. Another big one is enforcing MFA or TOTP. So basically block anything where MFA or TOTP is not enrolled. That is another hardening aspect for preventing illegitimate access into the network via the SSL VPN. And the last 2 sort of play hand in hand. One is for LDAP-S with certificate validation, just to protect directory traffic, and then also read-only LDAP bind accounts to sort of limit the blast radius if credentials are compromised.
So we're narrowing the tunnel by making it so only certain groups can get in, and then when those groups get in, we're lowering that blast radius through those bind accounts, right? So you're kind of taking this from like a twofold perspective, right? Where we're making sure that we reduce the number of people that can leverage or potentially leverage the SSL VPN, and then we're lowering the blast account or the blast radius for those accounts by making sure their scopes are appropriate as well. Awesome. Okay, so that's some kind of common things we see that access controls that can be put in place on the identity side. Let's talk a little bit about kind of like the networking and appliance side as well, right? We see a lot of those that have commonly like the management portal is exposed. We've seen some other things that threat actors are able to leverage. The big thing that we want to kind of focus in here is kind of like that number 11, right? So let's talk through a little bit about these, but really I want to focus focus on like number 11 and why that's so important, and why we have to have those patching programs in place for, when we turn around and see another, SSL VPN vulnerability that comes to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So a regular patching cadence is always a great thing, especially when it comes to SSL VPNs. I like to say that these sort of newer exploits are a dime a dozen nowadays. As Jason showed earlier, there's basically a new exploit or some sort of vulnerability in these appliances every week, if not every other week, which allows unauthorized access via the exploitation of that vulnerability. So having sort of a regular patching cadence to ensure, hey, I understand what's going wrong if they find a new vulnerability, there's a patch released, ensuring that everything's patched and up to date to prevent unauthorized access via the exploitation of these vulnerabilities for these specific appliances. When it comes to sort of the exterior posture aspect of things, number 7 would be the one to focus on as well. So, okay, we have the SSL VPN appliance on our public IP, but we want to limit the appliance management interface to only trusted IP addresses, if possible, forcing cert-based authentication. So, hey, I'm a management user for the appliance. I can only authenticate if my machine has a certificate, and sort of hardening that exterior posture to prevent, hey, that if unauthorized access into the management portal happens, it sort of has a bigger boom in the blast radius due to the nature of, hey, you have management access to the specific SSL VPN appliance itself. When it comes to the sort of brute forcing and sort of scanning of these specific appliances, the two biggest ones will be like enabling botnet filtering to sort of block known malicious IPs and command and control traffic, as well as focusing on account lockout policies. So again, a lot of the sort of known bad IPs out on the internet sort of tend to do the same thing over and over again. People are creatures of habit, especially when it comes to threat actors focusing on tradecraft that they know works eventually, or has worked in the past. So again, focusing on blocking known bad IPs, as well ensuring you have a account lockout policy for XYZ attempts forces the account to be disabled. That also plays hand in hand with sort of 10 and 12, where we have only allowing authorized users and removing default unuser accounts. So again, when I alluded back to the sort of, hey, scan accounts, print accounts, things of that nature, review sort of the VPN group you have published in Active Directory and sort of that group of users that can access the SSL VPN, and make sure, hey, there's no one in there. If there is a worker that's no longer with the organization, ensure that their access is properly revoked. If there's default sort of service accounts that have weak passwords, remove their access, things of that natures. Just focusing fully on sort of the role-based identity when it comes to play of, okay, who we have the SSL VPN appliance, who and how should they be accessing this appliance for legitimate use cases?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, when we talk about like kind of like stale and old accounts, that comes back to kind of like offboarding, programs and policies as well, right? So we're kind of talking about two different internal policies, a patching cadence policy, and then kind of like an offboarding, onboarding policy for users to make sure that those things work hand in hand with some of these SSL VPN network controls, to ensure you're not kind of like leaving some things, kind of like left out there, right? We've seen some default accounts. We've even seen like old user accounts where passwords were reused. The threat actor was able to get in, and then ultimately, the partner and the end customer were kind of like, oh, that guy, used to work here like 3 years ago, right? And that account's just kind of left around, and it was initially able to be leveraged as a part of these things. I do want to take a step back for just a second, and Sam, from like a threat intel perspective, let's double down on like, why is this also important, right? Like when we talk about like our slides and things like this here, like, why do threat actors see these and kind of like, they salivate when they see stuff like this, right? Like they're like jackpots. Why do they like these, to see this kind of like CVEs and SSL VPN vulnerabilities? Why is it so attractive to them from their standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take it back to kind of the house analogy that you used earlier, right? Like everybody's house has a door, right? And so if you think about these notices, right, it's almost like, somebody's offering a universal key to anybody's house, right? Like that's pretty attractive to me if I'm like a burglar and somebody says, "Hey, I have this key that can let you into, all of the houses on this block." Like, yeah, I would totally take that up, right?
Yeah.
In that theoretical scenario, right? and so I think that's kind of the way to think about it, right? It's everybody's got to have these doors, and I think, I want to really touch down on the and double down on the cert based off, because I think that really is a huge that really is a way to like take out several birds with one stone, right? You know, you don't have to worry about that, you know, them spraying your, you know, spraying a username and password lists, right? Like if you're not allowing password based auth, then like you don't have to worry about that, right? It makes things, you know, a lot more secure. You don't have to worry about, obviously, you know, not to say you shouldn't clean up those stale accounts, but those stale accounts don't become as much of a risk because they can only authenticate with a certificate, right? And so I think that also is a you know, something to point out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all of this kind of wraps into kind of like that proactive security posture, right? So we do security posture scoring and security posture rating for our clients, but you know, we can talk about security posture generally, right? Where it's like, you know, you need to have kind of like that asset inventory management. You need to have those like deployment run books, proactive patching, you know, integrating those like AV solutions, and then, you know, from those SSL VPN appliances, logging to a SIEM or another solution so that you can detect compromise, right? So, you know, let's talk a little bit about like how all of this plays into that overall proactive security posture. And why each one of these things here at the bottom really help us to drive that security posture forward. So Nevin, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about from your side on kind of like why these things help to create that overall better security posture, and why we're really wanting to like look into these things to help make sure that those edge appliances are secure?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to these proactive security posture, it's always focusing on, okay, understanding how your organization works and sort of legitimate mechanisms that are out there. And long story short, the two words that sort of simplify that is asset inventory. So understanding sort of every endpoint, server, and edge device. So understanding everything that is within your network, what's exposed, what's exposed, what shouldn't be exposed, and sort of providing that analysis into, okay, we have, for example, a management panel exposed when it shouldn't be, or another good example is like RD web is exposed to the internet, then focusing on sort of these tested runbooks we have. So understanding, okay, we have all these assets within our network, we have these exposed appliances. If, say, we do get something that's compromised and we have this runbook, we're not worried about, okay, that specific appliance has a misconfiguration, there's something wrong with it, there's an any rule in the firewall or that specific appliance. So automating not only asset inventory and understanding sort of how you onboard and how the security posture that comes along with these onboarding within the runbooks sort of helps provide the security posture you need to prevent a lot of this unauthorized external access through SSL VPNs, RD web, anything that's proactively exposed. And when it does come to like proactive patching as well, it does that also comes into play when it comes to these SSL VPN appliances. So understanding, okay, this is my appliance, this is what I have with my network. Based on what's sort of happening on the world, these are the vulnerabilities that can impact the appliance. We need to ensure that it's proactively patched as quickly as possible to ensure that there's no sort of right of boom effect from an exploitation campaign against it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, those first three on the kind of like the bottom left, right? Asset inventory, run books, proactive patching, you know, we're talking specifically about those SSL VPNs. But then when we move a little bit further, we talk a little bit about AV integration, like AV EDR solutions, because you want to monitor those endpoints that the SSL VPN provides access to, right? We see threat actors log into the VPN, they laterally move in the network, they figure out where they are, they enumerate some things, and then they start dropping persistence mechanisms. So having those EDR solutions in place really help to ensure that, you know, moving forward, you're able to detect and respond to these kind of things, while also, you know, making sure that you're proactively increasing that security posture around the SSL VPNs as well. And then, you know, kind of last but not least in there, we're talking about like SIM logging as well, right? You know, a lot of these appliances have the capability to, you know, syslog out or directly connect via integrations to, you know, security services and solutions. So it's important to make sure that, you know, you have that capability where those logs can be reviewed, they can be alerted on, and then potentially triaged in the event of a breach, right? You know, Sam, I know we've looked at quite a few SSL VPN logs, you know, in a lot of different cases across the SOC. But when when you're engaged in an incident, what are some of like the breadcrumbs or, the bloody, fingerprints that you're looking for during a case that kind of jump out to you in these logs, and how are you triaging some of these logs so that way we can let partners know, like, here's patient zero, here's the initial access vector, so we can kind of definitively help them point in the right direction to making sure we get these things buttoned up from a remediation standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a few, I would say, few different angles to take it at, right? One of the things could be looking at, okay, what users are logging in, right? And so if we see, say there's, in a smaller environment, there might be like 5 users that typically log in. We see them log in every day. And then all of a sudden there's one user that we don't see on those other days, right? That one might stand out. Also, like time of day for login is kind of a huge one. And then IP, right? A lot of the again, going back to the user, you can kind of correlate like, hey, this user typically logs in from this IP or this subnet range, and now they're logging in from this other IP, right? And then we take it a step further and we look and we see, oh, that IP is tied to like a certain VPN provider, right, or some kind of hosting provider, jump box that the threat actor is using. But to kind of like get that initial like, hey, this stands out is definitely like user correlation, time of day login, and kind of like IP sourcing as well tied to those users.
I think the other important step that we haven't mentioned around SIEM logging is getting that stuff somewhere external, because how many times have we seen SSL VPN logs get nuked, right? Because threat actors go in and they attempt to hide their tracks, right? So they'll delete those things off the endpoint and out of the management console in order to kind of hide under the radar and hope that it makes recovery efforts that much worse, right? Like when you're trying to recover but you don't know who patient zero was, that's a problem. But this logging from a SIEM perspective, if you're logging that in real time, that helps to alert a security solution, but also give you a fallback in the event that those logs are destroyed or tampered with.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think that's a kind of a good run through of kind of some of the things that we generally see when we see an SSL VPN compromise. It helps us to kind of understand that proactive approach, that reactive approach, and then that recovery approach as well. But I do think we've kind of teed up a good conversation around SIEM altogether, right? So one of the things that we've referenced a lot is SIEM considerations and things that we are doing from a SIEM perspective. Is it your current deployment kind of like a proverbial dumping ground, or is it actually a useful tool that you are using to alert on and ultimately find threat actors or someone that's buried within your systems that's kind of lurking under the radar? So, Nate, I think this is perfect for kind of you to talk a little bit about like some of the common like pitfalls and recommendations that we have for SIEM, right? Some of the things that we commonly see other organizations do that can kind of lead to like SIEM being an added burden to their team rather than a force multiplier. So let's talk a little bit about like some of these like 6 common pitfalls that people kind of fall into when they're looking at like deploying and integrating SIEM solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Validating SIEM nowadays is a lot tougher than it was in like 10 years ago, and just kind of understanding the difference between like what we would have considered a data lake now versus a data ocean then, and kind of understanding almost the role of the modern SIEM when it comes to security perspective. But there is a lot of burden and almost management that comes with any SIEM. One of the biggest things is just kind of looking at the tuning alone, just kind of how the SIEM itself is going to be managed, where those that information when it comes to a tuning perspective is going to be changed. Like, is it just going to be a default settings where it's just fire and forget? Are you going to have that customization piece? Kind of looking at like what you need to keep that SIEM fine-tuned and running for your environment, because at the end of the day, no one wants a lot of that proactive noise that you just can't do anything about because it's often the default settings. And then a lot of that feeds into alert fatigue, kind of looking at how if you don't have a finely tuned SIEM, or if you have even a poorly tuned SIEM, especially with some of those default settings and default detections, that could just lead to flood after flood of notifications and alerts that at the end of the day just really slows down time. We talked a lot about how important time is for threat actors and how they know they're on a clock. If your SOC is just flooded with alert after alert from default poorly configured SIEM detections, all that's doing is giving the threat actor more time for your SOC analyst to even get to the important detections that would actually show them where the threat actors are, because they're just stuck triaging low fidelity detections that might be auto generated and things like that. And then including with those blind spots and giving them that time, there could just be those incomplete log coverage sections where it's just you don't have everything feeding into the SIM. And there's multiple reasons for that, which we'll cover under costs, but not having that full coverage when it comes to a log perspective, whether that's a SIM capability, a cost issue, a configuration issue, etc. Those gaps provide threat actors a lot of opportunities to move. Laterally movement was something we talked a lot about earlier. Anywhere where you have those log coverages kind of provides them those hiding spots where they can avoid your security teams. When it comes to cost, there is a lot of different billing methods for SIM. One of the most punishing is that ingestion-based pricing. Formerly, I've talked to a lot of partners that when they have SIMs solutions, they don't want to enable certain event codes because while they provide a massive amount of security value, they also come with a high cost because they have to ingest all of that in the SIM. That drives up their usage and their bill, gradually increases over time because they're adding all these security relevant events, but that ingestion based pricing is really hurting them. So then it comes down to a question of what's more important. Is it the security value we're getting out of these event codes, or is it protecting the budget for SIM? And that's been kind of a burden to a lot of security teams because for some for some events you want those extra coverages, but you just can't share that burden of the cost. And then, of course, all of that feeds really into the insufficient SOC staffing. If you're spending a fortune on your SIM, can you also afford to have the 24/7, 365 coverage that you would need to have a SOC to be actively monitoring your SIM on your own? And then, of course, when you have that SOC, the alert fatigue becomes even more important because you need to have a SOC staff that can actually manage the alert flow you're getting. So kind of circle back to point one, if you have no proactive tuning, you're relying on default detections with point two, that could lead to alert fatigue. And then you have your SOC staffing, you have to pay for enough SOC staffing to actually manage all that alert fatigue, and all of that kind of circles back into the unexpected cost of just operating the SIM and making sure you have that complete log coverage. So it all kind of falls back into almost an Ouroboros where each point here is eating off of each other, kind of focusing on how a lot of this can parallel and how it can always cause issues for a security operations team. And then lastly here, it's kind of focusing on not just kind of looking at the compliance minimums, but understanding where your logs are and how you can access them. It's very important to understand that a lot of times security events aren't always the second it happens, you see it, and you might need to have those 90, 180, 100, 365-day retention periods to kind of understand a full scope. We've seen instances where nation-state threat actors will hide an environment for 6 months. Is your SIM capable of holding those logs for you for 6 months so that in the event of like cyber insurance involvement, you have those to provide? So the retention planning when it comes to SIM is also very important. But again, that really factors into the cost because the SIM provider is going to make you pay more for that.
Yeah. So I really like kind of like the cyclical nature of these pitfalls, right? Where one compounds on the next, and we have these kind of like ongoing issues that you have to manage with a SIM. I'm kind of looking at the responses here in the polls as well, and somewhat effective is kind of leading the pack here, and in a close second place is we don't rely on a SIM, right? So these solutions can be complex and kind of evolving, and it does require quite a bit of management and a team behind them to ensure that overall we're getting the effect that we want out of them. So kind of like when we're looking at SIM solutions and talking about like before you buy, during the evaluation process, and then the architecture around that, let's kind of talk a little bit about kind of like some of your common recommendations, Nate, when we're looking at like these solutions and how they can make an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing is to really just ask, why do we need a SIM in the first place? Like really understand the use cases and the importance to your organization for what the SIM is going to support. Not every SIM is equal and not every SIM is going to have the same focus, right? There's a lot of just, data lakes based solutions. There's a lot of just compliance based solutions. There's a lot of security based solutions. So it's really understanding what gradual flow of that really makes most sense for your organization. And then the second piece is there's almost the premium tag. While you understand the use cases you need, how premium do you want to go in terms of a SIM solution to meet those use cases, as the cost, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is super important. And then a lot of that factors also into the staffing. Is it understanding, like, are you getting a monitored SIM? Or can you pay extra to have it be monitored by an external security operations team? Are you relying on your own? Is it more MDR focused, or is it just purely for compliance so you don't need that monitoring? A lot of that, like understanding your use cases and understanding your cost goals, really kind of helps you understand. And then you have to balance that with the staffing piece, right? Because every line of budget is going to be directly impacted by the staffing, whether that's the internal or external teams you'd be relying on. And then you have to understand, like, how can I use this to get a better solution if it's not self-managed, and typically that's through like outsourcing the security operations or like an MDR provider, or having the SIM solution provide their own monitoring. But the evaluation period is extremely important, kind of understanding, like, once you decide your use cases, understanding, is this the right SIM for me? And with that, we always recommend testing with real data. Obviously, a lot of SIM solutions will provide, data sets you can run, scripts you can run, things like that to trigger events. But testing with the real data is the most important, because at the end of the day, that's your data. You can actually see it in real time, and you can have that monitoring. And it's kind of shows you a little more of the, as we put it here, the real world noise versus just, the scripted noise or the scripted demo. And then a lot of that can be benchmarked with search speed. I can speak from the security side. The speed of the searches is super important. Sam was talking a lot earlier about how threat actors know they're on a clock, and if you have a super slow SIM that just takes you forever to find the data, you're just adding more seconds to that threat actor's clock to be able to just do anything nefarious that they're trying to do, and kind of slow. And you're just, not, I want to say intentionally slowing your team down, but your technical limitations are slowing your team down to be able to catch and stop those threat actors. And then when it comes to more of the architecture piece, as I mentioned, you really want that longer term retention if possible, as there's a lot of different ways you can store logs, but there's also a lot of reasons why you might need to retrieve older logs. Just kind of looking at some of the threat actor activities and why you might need that longer coverage. And then lastly, you kind of have the piece of, like, is it just SIM or do you need SOAR as well? Kind of looking at the automation piece for alert triage and response, kind of looking at how you could reduce that analyst load, and focus on, like, what the platforms offer for you that can kind of reduce some of that alert fatigue, the SOC burnout, and then also, more importantly, improve your time to respond. Kind of shorten that threat actor's clock when you're using some of these automation pieces instead of just having the slower options. Having that automation could really improve your response.
Yeah. Force multiplier, right? Not a force detractor. You want that SIM to really be able to elevate your team and enhance the overall workflows, rather than slowing your team down and your team having to really dig through a mountain of data to kind of find that molehill that the threat actor has created. So let's talk a little bit kind of like the Blackpoint SIM alerting in action, right? Like, how do we kind of take this approach in a more unique fashion to kind of level up the detections and things like that for the teams, like, the Sams and the Nevins that are doing that incident response and engaging when we do have an incident?
Yeah, absolutely. So Blackpoint SIM monitoring is one of our newest offerings. Our first detections went live a couple months ago, so this is something we're super excited about to be able to share. And from a detection piece, we're super happy with where it's at right now, but we're going to keep growing it. And most importantly, we're going to grow it by adding new log sources, so that we're just really broadening that detection coverage. So it doesn't matter what providers are currently using, whether that's your SSL VPN provider, your firewall provider, or even your password manager. We can kind of expand that and have that dedicated detection library for you. But one of the biggest things we want to focus on is that detection coverage, to make sure we have these finely tuned, high fidelity detections to really focus on what threat actors are going after, most importantly, from some of these log sources. So currently, that's taking the place of, we have over 30 unique detections, most importantly backed by our enrichment library. So we're able to take the enrichment engine we use for our ITDR offering, Cloud Response, and put that into our SIM coverage to look at a lot of malicious logins. So it gives us a very high fidelity for those SSL VPN compromises. We're able to look at the logins the same way we would like a potentially compromised M365 tenant, Google Workspaces. And then I listed a couple of sample log sources we're covering right now, which include Sysl Meraki, FortiGate Firewall, SonicWall. We're also looking at password managers like LastPass and 1Password, fun things like that. But most importantly, the alert spread. Kind of just looking at where we're seeing with SIM, as we've talked a lot about in this call, and I'm sure you guys will get tired of hearing us say about it, but the SSL VPN abuse has been overall the most common alert type we've seen out of any of our SIM logging. Looking at the malicious SSL VPN logs, or SSL VPN abuse attempts and things like that. I included an example here at the bottom I'll go over in a minute of just an example threat actor we saw attempting to abuse SSL VPN, but that's been the number one, the crowning jewel for SIM detections, is really looking at how we can better detect the SSL VPN abuse by pulling those logs in directly from those SSL VPN providers into SIM, deploying our detections on top of our SIM library, and kind of really reusing that source as just an extra pair of eyes for the SOC. And of course, this is all backed by our real-time monitoring. So you guys know us best for our 24/7, 365 monitoring with the SOC. The SIM filters right in the same way. So there's no disruption there. There's no longer times to respond or anything like that. And then lastly, I included this example of a SOC response we had recently for SIEM. So in this case, we saw the threat actor was stealing the SSL VPN credentials with phishing. They basically were able to phish this user, get their SSL VPN credentials. In this case, the public-facing portal was exposed, so they enumerated that portal, they knew where it was, they're able to use those credentials to log in. The issue is when they logged into the portal, they used a commercial VPN IP. So I'm talking about the kind of VPN you get ad for on YouTube, something extremely common. We've all heard of all the same providers, but that was the VPN of choices they used when they were logging into the SSL VPN. So it's a little uncommon to see someone authenticating to your VPN with a VPN. So we of course alerted to that. I talked a little bit about our enrichment engine on the previous slide. That was a part of this detection piece. Our enrichment engine immediately enriched that IP, detected as a part of a commercial VPN. And that triggered an alert to the SOC, so that's like Sam and Nevin's teams. And we were able to alert that immediately for the risky login based on that enriched IP. And then our SOC was able to disable that account to prevent that further compromise. And then we were able to call the partner directly and kind of work with them on their remediation piece, as we saw this was attempted SSL VPN abuse. And we've gone over how dangerous that could be if the threat actor has the key to your front door. So that's kind of the general alert flow for a lot of these. And like I said in the alert spread, we've been seeing these a lot.
Yeah. And it helps to just stop those things even further left of boom, right? We're almost getting left of boom at this point, right? By seeing that VPN login and then immediately locking that account down, they don't even have a chance to laterally spread into the environment and start poking around at what access they have, because we're just chopping that access off right as soon as it's initiated with that VPN log and that SIM log that we ingest as well. So I think this is kind of like a really good wrap up of everything that we've been talking about today. We've talked about kind of like, application control and the importance it has, how it kind of connects to SSL VPN compromise and follow-on activity from threat actors. And then that SSL VPN compromise connects to kind of like SIM-based alerting and ingesting those logs, retaining those logs, and ultimately ensuring that you can alert on that activity to kind of catch this stuff as left of boom as possible. So I do appreciate everyone hanging out with us today. I know we're a few minutes over, but I hope that the content, as always, is meaningful and impactful for you all. I do know that an email will go out with this recording, along with the slides, so you all have that capability. And then last but not least, if you're interested in a free trial with Blackpoint, you can scan the QR code here, and that will take you to some of our free trial offerings. But again, much appreciated for everyone joining us for our threat landscape call for the month of May. Really looking forward to seeing everyone in June on the next event as well. Thanks, everyone.